welcome back from lunch. And just want to, and to those of you who are just arriving, welcome to this wonderful conference today. And I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service at American University, and delighted that we have our terrific panel today. I think the full bios are in your packets, but Kori Schake from the Hoover Institution at Stanford, Etienne de Durand at IFRI in Paris, and Gade at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, all have significant experience inside and outside of government to help us with this panel discussion on reassurance, collective defense, and dissuasion, which has, of course, received a lot more attention in the last few months and was discussed a little bit at our keynote just prior to lunch with Assistant Secretary Derek Chalet, and I think we'll want to pick up some of the things that were discussed, that Derek was discussing with Ian Brzezinski. But we will start first with brief remarks from each of our panelists, and then I'll start a discussion and then open it up to you. But I really hope that we'll be able to address both the issue of, in the particular context of what's happened in Ukraine, what is the actual Russian threat to NATO? As we know and has been discussed, Ukraine is not a NATO member. There was a suggestion in the previous session that Russia understands there's a line they can't cross. What exactly does that mean? And you know, what is the threat that's posed by what's occurred in Ukraine? And then what are the broader set of issues associated with reassurance and collective defense? And then what are the things that can be done to strengthen reassurance and collective defense? And particularly interested in my two European colleagues up here to say a little bit about what they think is the sentiment across Europe, divisions within Europe, and answering, again, the challenge from the last session in which it was argued that the $1 billion that President Obama announced for reassurance was an invitation to our European allies to bring other dishes to the picnic, I guess is how it was put. So with that opening, Kori, please.
Okay, so the question that you asked that I will answer is, what threat does Russia pose to NATO? I actually don't think Russia poses much of a physical threat. Namely, I think the Norwegian Air Force or the Polish army could actually hold their own quite well against the Russian military. I don't, even with all the defense spending of the last several years and the upgrading of capabilities, I actually think Russia is a weak country playing a bad hand quite well. And we in the West have a very strong hand, and we're not playing it very well. And so I think the Russian risk to us is twofold. First, we are persuading ourselves we're not strong enough to manage this challenge, right? Like the notion that the United States has to rush reinforcing troops to be stationed in Poland because otherwise we won't be able to manage this threat. There are good reasons for sending troops to Poland. I'm not opposed to it. But what I'm saying is that we are talking ourselves into the belief that we are weak, and we are not. We are talking ourselves into the belief that nobody spends enough on defense in the West, that we're losing interoperability, that we don't have a central cohesive focus. And I just don't think any of that's true. And the Russian choices are actually causing us to really question whether we have the capacity to do this. And that's a huge achievement on the Russians' part. Like, that's a lot to have accomplished and having done very little. The second threat I think the Russians pose to us is the shadow of causing NATO governments to make choices about Russian populations. That is, their own citizens who are ethnically Russian or speak Russian. And if NATO countries make invidious choices, make frightened choices that push their own populations out of the mainstream, I actually think that too is a terrible outcome, something that the Russians should be happy if they can achieve, because at the end of the day, like, values are what make the West the West. It's what unites us. It's what we need to be able to make the case on the basis of to get any of our publics to go to war. And so I'm pretty worried that the Russians are actually making substantial progress on those two fronts, and they shouldn't be, because what they have done in Ukraine, for example, is a terrible thing, and they ought to pay consequences. I think the Western countries have done reasonably well in taking a situation where the Russians have lots of near-term advantages, but they're relatively small advantages compared to our longer-term advantages. It takes us time to get ourselves organized. It takes time for the German chancellor to make a case that German businesses need to impose sanctions in one of their most promising markets. It takes time for us to figure out how we're going to sensibly handle this, what it's going to take to reassure European allies, and how to get that into alignment. And I think, just to close, Jim, that we're making a little bit panicky near-term choices, like allowing this to be a conversation about defense spending, which aren't in our interests and play to Russia's advantages.
Great, thanks. All right, Etienne, as we go across the Atlantic here, get a little closer to the action.
Thanks to the Atlantic Council and also IFS for the invite and the opportunity to address this issue here in DC. As was mentioned this morning, I think we need to start with the political dimension because it comes first, as always. And I'll be very quick because you've heard it already, but first we must, within the alliance, everyone has to agree that something has happened and that there cannot be any return to business as usual. This does not mean that this is a return to the Cold War. This is neither peace like in the 90s, neither the Cold War. This is something new, and we have to recognize that. We have to recognize the fact that Russia has used force and the threat of force in both covert and overt ways, and therefore we cannot remain idle. And perhaps for the discussion, I would also offer that sanctions probably won't do it, that we should not put too much faith on sanctions, and sanctions actually are not the questions that is being asked in terms of reassurance. Since the Russians are using force, we need to respond in kind at the strategic and military level, and not so much with sanctions. And final point, and this is linked to sanctions, final point at the political level, of course, what's at stake is Western unity. And the Russians are trying, of course, to show that we're not united. So nothing would more damage the credibility of Article 5 that fractured NATO and open divisions. So we need to be very prudent about that, which is also why we need to be prudent about sanctions. Now, we also need to do our homework in terms of the military posture. And we need to tailor our posture to the likely threats, not just from Russia, by the way. And here, I think we also need to revisit some of our core assumptions. First assumption, we need to we used to, during the Cold War, prepare for the big one, the total war. Quite clearly, in the past 20 years, what we've done is limited wars, fought for over limited interests with limited political capital and financial resources. And this is the likely future for us. Second, we've modernized in Europe, especially so as to be able to do expeditionary warfare. I'm talking in general. The Brits and the French were already capable of doing that, but the rest of Europe has modernized to be able to go places with the Americans and with the Brits and the French. Now, that came as a price because at the same time, defense budgets were either stable or declining, most of the time declining. So in order to become expeditionary, most European militaries had to shrink their force and actually to do away with their high-end capabilities. So now we are in a place where, and this is probably here where we diverge, most European countries are just incapable of defending their territory. They neither have the numbers, nor the high-end capabilities, nor the readiness, nor the training. So the numbers that were used this morning, I think, by Ambassador Ischinger are just numbers on paper. They don't mean anything from a military point of view. And every time we've entered serious military operations, we had the proof that very few European countries were actually able and ready from a military point of view to intervene. Second, I think we should still, at the military level, we need to draw lessons of what's happened with Crimea and Ukraine and the Russian strategy. First, speed is of the essence. We need to prevent fait accompli. And if we're not able to do that, we might be much more powerful than Russia, but still we will be in trouble. Second, we do need some numbers We do need some mass to cover borders, if only to block in a credible way Russian attempts at coercion through mobilization, which has happened with Ukraine. We also need tailored intelligence capabilities to monitor dangerous activity and attempted subversion, like what we've seen in Ukraine. And finally, we need to improve our strategic communication capabilities and expose external propaganda for what it is, especially in our own countries, by the way. The target audience is not so much the Russians than our own publics in Europe, I'm afraid. So all this makes for a tall order, especially in an age of austerity, as we all understand. We have weakened transatlantic links. We have European divisions as well. But there are a few things that I think are feasible and that we should prepare ourselves to do. First, to improve our speed of response, and without stationing significant capabilities in Eastern Europe, which is not going to happen, if only for financial reasons, but also political reasons, probably we should look towards creating small depots of materiel in selected places like Estonia or Baltic countries, maybe Poland and a few others, a little bit after the reforger model of the Cold War, but on a much smaller scale. This is all the more feasible than the Americans, the British, and the French are shrinking their land forces. So it means we're going to have excess material. So this is physically doable. This does not exclude a very limited presence, either on a rotational basis or permanent, as political tripwire. But we're talking, few dozens, maybe a few hundreds at top, at maximum. We need also, and this has been said already, to increase the number and also the realism of our live-ex, military exercise and maneuvers. I mean, the last time we were in a very big maneuver in Western Europe was 1989, Moinoardi, a Franco-German maneuver. So as I usually say, most divisional commander in Europe don't know what a division looks like. They've never seen one in their career. So it might be time to, do exercises at that level. But rotations and exercises are not going to do the trick. To solve the problem of mass, so to speak, we should go further, and we should especially acknowledge what exists already, namely a division of labor between different European countries. Quite clearly, when you look at Poland and Finland today, they are really focusing on collective defense, territorial defense, frankly speaking, and not so much about expeditionary warfare, whereas Western European countries put most of their capabilities and training for expeditionary missions. We should accept that. We're not going, we don't have the budgets to be capable of doing everything everywhere in Europe. So we should be there, the French and the British and hopefully the Germans and certainly the Americans, to provide direct support, certainly, and also to provide high-end capabilities that the Finns or the Poles don't have. So that we can block potential escalation, we can effect conventional deterrence and block potential escalation at the conventional level. We also need to stop cutting high-end, high-intensity forces all across Western Europe, by the way. Today, just to give you one figure, the Poles have more tanks than the British and French and Germans combined, if we're talking modern tanks. We have very few tanks and artillery pieces left, and we are going down very quickly in terms of planes as well. So in 2020, we are going this way, and yes, the Russians are still weak, but they are going this way. So at one point, we are going to cross, except for the US, obviously. Finally, we need to, and this is going to be popular, I guess, this one, we're going to start a new conversation about nuclear deterrence and understand how popular it is in Europe. But we need to think about limited nuclear options in ways that we haven't in the past, or very, very little, so as to have credible options just in case. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in situations where the burden that will be placed upon US capabilities and US nuclear capabilities will be probably too great. And let me finish on this before turning to France, because you wanted me to say a few words about France. The real issue today is not multilateral versus unilateral, is not NATO versus EU. The real issue is money, it's costs, okay? We need to ensure that reassurance is not seen as a costly duty by Western services, whether British or French or even American. I mean, if they have to take money to go exercise in Estonia out of their own budget, this is a problem. So we have to find ways that those exercises, those rotations, are transparent for Western countries, that they don't cost more than they would if they were to take place in the home country. So probably we need to revisit the rules, the costing rules within NATO, because in reality today, most of NATO is being funded by 6 nations, as we all know. That's a problem. And especially for middle powers like the British and the French, we are in a position where we are asked to pay once to get our military capabilities, pay twice via NATO, via the common budget, and pay a third time if we want to get there and do exercises. In such an age of austerity, this is just not possible. So we have to find new ways of spreading the costs. Finally, a few words about France. The French are ready to do their part. We did by sending Rafale. During the crisis, we take our tour in Baltic air policing. Rumor has it that Eastern contingencies were taken into account in the French Defense White Paper 18 months ago. That explains why the budget was not cut further. That explains also why we kept some high-end capabilities that, frankly speaking, we don't need to do Mali. Finally, we certainly do our part in terms of burden sharing in the southern flank. And here, despite the calls for a European army that we heard this morning, we found ourselves practically alone in Mali, but for the US in terms of information and the Chadians on the ground. But there was very little European help, I must say. Yes, there are still problems regarding reassurance in my country. I'm sure that Mistral will pop up during the question, so I'm not going to talk about it now. We'll save it for the debate. There is also in France, like in many other European countries, voices that are sympathetic to Russia, that think that we've pushed them too far, that we've humiliated them. So from a domestic political perspective, this is not necessarily easy to do the reassurance. But again, I want to end by emphasizing that the real issue is the cost issue. If we can find ways to, if not solve it, at least attenuate the problem, then France and I'm sure also the UK will be more than ready to do their part for the reassurance mission. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Well, and our third speaker has such extensive military experience to bring to bear on this discussion, so I look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you. I will also concentrate on what we can do, since you asked about that one, and I think to be able to excuse me, to reassure alliance members and potential adversaries, deter potential adversaries, these measures must be both credible and visual. And I think one important reassuring measure is contingency planning. We talked about that earlier today. But that is not necessarily because there is an immediate need to execute such plans, but the reassurance the process gives by focusing on the security situation and the consequences NATO will face if such plans need to be executed. And as we heard also earlier today, NATO is working on a new plan for Bulgaria and Romania, and a revision of the plan for Poland and the Baltic states, and also the plan for Norway. And I think that these strategic plans should be supported also by more detailed plans at the operational level. I don't see the need for very detailed planning as we had during the Cold War and in the early 1990s, but at least we need credibility concerning available and well-trained forces, deployment capacity, command and control arrangements, sustainability, and strategic communications. So far, it seems that existing plans are too dependent on the NATO response force. We may need a more robust and flexible basis for force generation. It will be important for NATO to consider if we have the capabilities needed and if they are rightly placed, not only for conventional defense, but also for hybrid warfare. As we all know, and that has also been alluded to earlier today, most of the European nations need to contribute more. And regardless, good initiatives as smart defense, pooling and sharing, and framework nation concept, defense budget in most of the countries has to increase. And on the other hand, NATO is dependent on strong US leadership, and I think stronger than we have seen over the last years. Credible dissuasion and reassurance are also dependent on a functional NATO command structure. During the last revision, the NATO command structure was reduced from a manning of around 13,200 down to around 8,500. And one premise for that reduction was that the NATO command structure should be fully manned by qualified personnel. So far, only 6 nations fulfill that premise. And our particular concern is that one of the nations that most strongly argued for even a small structure has a fill rate of less than 70%. And even if the fill rate will improve by the end of December next year, when the full operation capability is expected, NATO need to consider if we have a command structure well suited for future missions. The answer may be that the structure is too small and not robust enough. So creating a standby pool of personnel who can rapidly be inserted into the NATO command structure and making better use of the knowledge and situational awareness at national headquarters could improve the situation. A robust NATO force structure with the right capabilities and response time is also very important. It seems that the thinking so far has been that the NATO response force is the right answer to all the challenges. That will probably not be the right answer for the future, but hopefully the work on the Joint Expeditionary Force and the Framework Nation concept may contribute to the right balance of capabilities, response time, and operational effectiveness. NATO is a unique alliance with the military structure as a tool for the political leadership. In order to be seen credible for deterrence and reassurance, the NATO command structure and the NATO force structure have to prove they can deliver, both during operations but also through exercises. So post-ISAF, it will be important to show force through realistic exercises, covering the whole spectrum from low tension to high intensity warfare. One high-value exercise every 3 years is not enough, but much can be done by better coordination and to combine national and NATO exercises. This will also be part of the Connected Forces initiative, where it will be important to include partners so we can continue to be interoperable and have the capability to work together also in future operations. The Europeans should also be more supportive to the United States by participating in exercises in the US and in areas of strategic importance for them. With ISAF, NATO's focus has been very much on land and air. Post-ISAF, it is time to look closer on the maritime side. Operation Ocean Shield can be seen as a success, but to use frigates hunting pirates is not cost-effective and prohibits the crew to train and exercise the whole range of warfare areas they need to execute high-intensity operations. There has been a discussion if NATO needs 4 standing maritime forces when the nations have problems in filling the billets. But regardless of how we organize the maritime forces, I think we need to consider how we use them. We could adapt the schedule for the old standing Naval Force Atlantic. That means that in peacetime, the maritime forces are scheduled to operate where you find the capabilities for proper opposition to train and exercise the whole spectrum of maritime warfare. And the impact exercise could be a good example. And with some coordination, national and NATO exercises could be better tailor-made for NATO's standing maritime forces. We need to ensure that the maritime forces have the required capacity and that they can respond quickly when needed. Visibility of NATO in all NATO countries can be important for deterrence and reassurance. For those countries where no NATO infrastructure exists, pre-positioning of equipment, temporary stationing of forces from alliance members, and NATO exercises and training could be helpful. And as I have mentioned earlier, deterrence and reassuring measures must be credible and visible. And these measures must be followed by a clear and coordinated strategic communication, sending the message that NATO is a strong alliance. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks to all 3 of our panelists for getting us off to such a good start and for their differences of opinion, which is always helpful for a good conversation. I want to push a little further on the issue of the need for reassurance. Kori argued that Russia doesn't pose a physical threat in the sense of Russia attacking countries that are in the alliance, but what has occurred has sown doubt in the alliance in where people really weren't thinking about these issues previously. And I remember back when NATO was being discussed within the U.S. government in the 1990s, there was significant concern in the Pentagon, and one of the concerns from the Pentagon at that time was, well, about enlarging NATO, when you taking new members, there is this Article 5 guarantee, and so you're committing to their security. And most of the people on the political side, State Department, people on Capitol Hill, were not really thinking about the fact that you might actually have to defend any of these new members, and so there wasn't much thought given to it. Well, what President Putin has done through the actions in Ukraine is he's forced people to think about defending these countries. And so, of course, for the countries themselves, if you're a country like Estonia and you're vulnerable and you depend on others for your security, there's no amount of reassurance that's ever going to completely convince you that people would be there for you if you really needed them, because you're vulnerable, you're dependent on others. And so you have this rush to reassure, but you also have a real question of, well, I don't know, would we be there for them? I mean, and you see this in the discussion both in the United States and Europe about, what it would really mean to really say, yes, we'll be there for you, and sort of an effort to overachieve with respect to the language of reassurance. And so I just want to ask you how you see this really more in the sort of the psychological terms of what it means for an alliance that is built around Article 5 and collective defense, but is only really now having to come to grips with the notion of, oh yeah, we'd really all be there for each other.
So I'm a historian of the 1950s and 1960s, and actually the conversation we are having now feels very much like the conversation of the late 1950s, where it's all about extended deterrence. That could France actually really rely on the United States? And wouldn't Germany perhaps have a better choice rather than taking a strong Western stand to sort of, play the seam of that a little bit and be on both teams? This is a constant conversation in an alliance of free people, and we actually shouldn't be afraid of it, and we shouldn't overreact to it. The Estonians are right to be worried about it, as are other frontline states, and we are right to try and reassure them about that. Because I actually don't think an American president couldn't fail to honor an Article 5 guarantee. And so there's a little bit of a reason why people are more worried about getting American troops there than, Italian troops there, right? Because if we go, others will also. And if we don't go, then that creates a much bigger magnitude of problem. But whatever Russia's ambitions are for the West, they actually can't have a reasonable proposition of either preventing us from defending our allies or preventing our allies from defending themselves. And that's the right restraint on the Russians. They couldn't win at this. That doesn't mean they won't try it, but we're long tested both in this conversation, and I was struck actually as you two gentlemen were talking at how practical and how solid the specific recommendations you made were. And that's actually what NATO's great at. The price the Russians are going to pay, if you don't mind my saying so, for what they have done in Crimea, is NATO's going to get serious about Article 5 defense again, which it hasn't been in some substantial amount of time.
Right. Thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I fully support that, but I think it's important that we now come from for many years been talking about it. You have to show it. It has to be visual that you can stand up to the Article 5, and that's why I think that we have prudent planning that we have really showing it through exercises and so, and that has been a problem, of course, over the last years, also due to the financial crisis. That it is costly to do these big exercises. It's easy with computer assisted exercises, but really having foot on the ground and train the whole thing. But that is the way I think you really can do reassurance to those nations or those people that feel that put questions mark to NATO's ability to stand up to the Article 5.
If I may, I think the problem we have is that we can envisage scenarios that are below the radar screen in terms of defense, like we've seen in Ukraine, with resort to unconventional or irregular warfare that makes it kind of difficult for us to invoke Article 5. We can also think of situations where, again, there is a fait accompli because things happen very quickly, which is why we need a minimum, and this is not a return to the Cold War, but a minimum so that those possibilities are not open to any adversary, whether Russia or another.
What short of stationing troops on NATO's eastern perimeter would prevent that?
Rotations and a few number of troops. Churchill's phrase, all I want is one US soldier, preferably dead. So, but I would also add that to make it credible in the Hill here, you would need also to have a few British and French soldiers dead. The point should be the following, and I hope that would be reassuring to our Eastern allies. We should organize ourselves in such a way that the onus of escalation rests on the Russians and not on us. When you look at Crimea, if we imagine we would have wanted to do something, then we would have had to escalate, which is politically was simply not feasible.
But we actually are organized that way, right? The Russians would have to escalate. They would have to invade Estonia.
Well,
like the onus of escalation is on them.
But they can
politically, but not militarily.
Right, but they can also, as we've seen, one of the things that they can do is they can use the presence of the Russian population there to do things that destabilize the situation for the government, or at least just, put pressure on the government, make the government nervous. Again, it's really, I think, a psychological question, but an important psychological question.
Oh, I absolutely agree. It's an important psychological question. But the solution to that is inclusive governance on the part of those governments, right? That's how we fix this problem, which is Russian Estonians feeling Estonian as well as Russian. All of us in diverse societies deal with that, and good governance and inclusive governance is the solution. But again, even there, the Russians have to escalate, right? They have to foment discontent in a relatively benign situation. And as the Ukrainian government did, I think, pretty well once the crisis started, which was to come up with a program to address the legitimate political grievances of Russians in Ukraine. That's the solution to it.
Except that when you look at what's happened in Crimea, quite clearly, I'm not saying that the Russians provoked the crisis, but quite clearly, given the speed with which the annexation took place, quite clearly this had been planned militarily.
Right, yes, right.
This is not an improvisation.
Probably since 2008. But
I don't know since when, but all I'm saying is that you do not improvise that kind of operation. So I can imagine circumstances where trouble could happen within Article 5 covered territories, not so much because the Russians or other countries, by the way, are interested in invading us, Cold War type, that's not the point, but just to show that they can do something and that there will be very little reaction if they stay below that radar screen I mentioned.
I want to follow up with all three of you, and then I will open it up. I want to make sure we get plenty of time for your comments and questions. President Obama, the $1 billion announcement, you then have the people in this government working to actually
figure out what the president meant.
Figure out what we would do. So I want Kori to comment on that. And then to European panelists, you heard Derek Chalet in the previous session talk about this as what the United States was putting on the table with the expectation that Europeans would then bring their own dishes to the picnic, and your thoughts on what we're likely to see with respect to European reaction. But will you start and explain to us how this is going to work to actually make this concrete?
I don't know, but I don't think they know either. I actually think it was a bad idea on the president's part for two reasons. First, because I do think it was a sort of reflexive overreaction and the continuity and strength and unity of the alliance is where he should have vested his response. But the second thing is announcing that the US is going to spend $1 billion and then telling everybody else, we're waiting to see your response. I suffered through a lot of alliance management in my time in government, and that is a recipe for disaster, right? Because this is sort of like the Obama administration with the surge in Afghanistan, right? We're going to add 30,000 additional forces, and what are you folks going to add? And in their minds, the expectation was Europe will match us, and then Congress will be happy, and this will be a binding thing across the Atlantic. And that's an improbable outcome, but it's an absolutely impossible outcome unless you have made somebody like Barry and Damon work in advance to get the Europeans locked in on it. And so the president should have announced a $3 billion NATO reinforcement fund if he was going to announce anything, and he should have the British Prime Minister and the French President and everybody else lined up when he does it. Because now the story is instead going to be allies won't contribute, everybody expects us to do everything. Even if they do this exactly right from here, they have actually created the metric that they are going to be graded by, and it's not going to be successful. So my mom's going to be asking, why are we putting $1 billion into strengthening somebody else's defense? Why aren't they putting $1 billion into strengthening their defense when their neighbor just got invaded?
All right, guys.
I'm sorry, I didn't actually answer the question. The answer to the question is spend it all on multilateral exercises.
I think you're quite right. I'm afraid that what the Europeans are coming up with is a little more of what we do already. I mean, a little more people, more soldiers, maybe showing the flag, more exercises, and so on. So how substantial that will be, I'm not sure, but I think that is the thinking. So it's difficult.
I think I've answered already.
Yeah.
Unless we find ways to attain with the cost problem, this is not going to happen. We just cannot. So my advice for our Eastern European allies would be to make sure that they create incentives for the Brits and the French to show up. It's not a question. It's not a political problem. It's a financial problem. Every 100 million euros or pounds that you take away from the army or the air force in our country will not be replaced by national treasury. So the battle we are fighting now is a battle with treasury. This is the real enemy. This is not the Russians. This is, we are trying to survive. No, but it sounds like a joke, but it's not, actually, because there are only 5 or 6 European countries that are still serious.
It's not a joke. It's a good tweet, actually. But anyway, so somebody out there, I hope somebody out there is tweeting it out.
For those of you who don't know that and probably don't know, a little more than a month ago, all the French chiefs together, plus the minister, threatened to resign because they were faced with the possibility of a new round of cuts. So the message from the personal opinion, but to our Eastern European allies, make it attractive for our services to get there, and they will.
Great. Okay.
Maybe another point. I mean, my experience from NATO is that it's very easy for during ministers' meetings, summits, and so on, that you make good plans and decisions. But it all comes down to what we talk about here on the financial side. Because when it comes to the bureaucracy in NATO and the nations start to look at what the cost and so on, very often it ends with no action. So maybe we have to go back to the beginning at NATO, because at that time in the beginning we also had a committee of the financial ministers. So maybe that should, let's say, bring them into the picture, so that you can follow up good intentions and good decisions on the top level, also by financial strength, and say, well, you have decided to do so and so, get the money.
Just quickly, obviously, what I'm saying, and this is not about your country, Mr. Ambassador, but some European countries.
The whole conference is about Estonia.
No, it's not. It's not. But
So frequently.
some European countries are spending today, as we speak, around 0.6 or 0.7 of GDP on defense. The very same ones are asking us to show up to do reassurance and to pay for the exercises. You know, at one point they have to be logical. Instead of spending the very small amount of money they are spending to effect practically nothing in military terms, they should do more to finance those exercises and perhaps some infrastructure and stuff like that. That would be much more logical, and that would be probably much more feasible than a European army. And finally, if we are to look for a piggy bank in Europe, I think we all know where it is.
Right. But on that note, so if you can introduce yourself, you wait for Mike, introduce yourself, and if you could ask a brief question, because the briefer the questions, the more time we have for our answers. So we'll go right here.
Good afternoon, Bill Timmey from IBM. With the conventions of conflict have developed over hundreds of years. In the in 2008 with Georgia, we sort of saw a new effect. In cyber conflict, we can now affect national infrastructure from remote without any physical presence. Is there any trend of political discussion or thought being collected as far as appropriate responses for various actions now? Because it's right now it's we're not sure what to do, but is there any conventions of conflict that are developing in this area now?
And why don't we, since everyone else had a question, why don't we just hand the mic right up in front there, and we'll get both questions on the table.
Thanks. Hi, R1 Lagadek from George Washington. After Georgia, we found out the Russians had much soul-searching to do about how their military had broken apart halfway to Tbilisi. To what extent do you think, in spite of the efforts that they clearly undertook in the past few years, that they are not leading their own reach in Ukraine? They are now realizing what they cannot do because their army still has not been fixed. Is it a valid point to say that what are they finding out right now about the state of their military? That was Kori's opening point, that we all need to burst the Putin bubble about their capacity. We all tend to speak up, again, the infiltration, the asymmetrical tactics that they utilize in Crimea, but is it fair to say that they would have, in a Russian ideal world, they would have wanted to do more, and that they've been stuck with asymmetry and infiltration because they are realizing that they can't do anything but, including the decision now to rescind the authority to go to use force into Crimea? Are they being in fact led by the limitations of their capacity? Is that fair to say?
Okay, so I love that question, which is, what are the Russians learning from the Russian incursion into Ukraine? I think that's fantastic. I agree with you that if the Russians thought that they could achieve the military effects they wanted by, more glorious silk scarf means, they probably would have, right? Because it looks a lot more impressive when you roll tanks into a place with banners flying from it, right? You look stronger, you look more assertive. That they have been driven to the margins of conflict is a good thing for us. But I'm not sure that military means are the reason that they were driven to the margin of conflict. That is, it bought them an enormous amount of time to consolidate what they were trying to do, that we had to figure out whether this was the Russians acting or whether it was Ukrainians acting. It bought them time, it bought them political deniability, it achieved their aims in lots of ways. So it may not be that they chose to do this on the margins of the conflict spectrum because they had no alternative. What do I think they're learning? Their near-term advantage is, as of course always, it takes a while for the West to get organized and to persuade my mom and everybody else's mom that we actually have to do something about this. If I were the Russians, I would actually be surprised that we were able to get any economic sanctions passed. That, I think, I'm not surprised that we couldn't get, Siemens out of Moscow. I'm surprised we got anything given the nature, the weakness of Western economies at the moment, the nature of the European economic crisis and the way it's alarmed people. I'm surprised the Russians didn't get more bang for their buck in splitting Germany off from the rest of the West. So militarily, I think if I were them, I would be much more worried that they blew the element of their new doctrine on Ukraine when they might actually have blown it on Estonia or someplace else. Because now we're going to adapt and respond to it, right? We are going to get ourselves organized to figure out how to tell early on in irregular circumstances who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and NATO's going to do what NATO does, as it did with cyber, to answer your question, which is we are ploddingly, systematically, slowly going to establish a center for excellence. I won't say where it is because we're focusing too much on one country. But we're going to develop a doctrine, which I think NATO put out the draft of already, about how we're going to do this. We're going to start getting the wheels churning about how do we respond? Is this an Article 5 case? What do we do about it? The boys down at Norfolk are going to be thinking about how do we incorporate cyber in our own operations, because clearly our enemies are using it. Like, slowly, we're grinding forward on this. And I think there's actually been a reasonable amount of work done within the alliance. And some of the Scandinavian allies have actually done a lot better work than we, the United States, have.
As the saying has it, the Russian military is never as strong as they think it is, and never as weak as we think it is. Depending on who you're talking to, some people would tell you that they have between 40,000 and 80,000 combat-ready troops. What is for sure is that first, they are much better than during Georgia. We've seen them improve, and we have ways of being sure that it's the case. And second, that they, from what has transpired from NATO and other places, that along the border, they had put in place the means that would have allowed them to get it into Ukraine if they wanted to. Now, yes, I do think it's a strategic calculus that they did not send the tanks rolling in, because obviously political damage would have been, enormous. That being said, the good surprise here comes from Ukraine itself and the Ukrainians. And I think they were not expecting that level of resistance because, let's be frank, Ukraine is completely penetrated by the Russians in terms of intelligence, for obvious historical reasons. So the surprise comes more, to me at least, from Ukraine than it does from Western Europe, where they didn't expect us to do much against them, but they did not expect us, or even the Germans, to be neutral on they understood from the start in Moscow that things would get hairy with the West. Now, does that mean that, again, all I do is looking at the trends. And when I look at the trends, military trends, and I refer you to a very good publication by my friend and colleague from SVP in Berlin, Christian Mölling for the European Defense Agency, when you look at how far demilitarization has gone for the past 10 years, and not all the decisions are being taken into account, because some decisions are being made now, and so we'll see the result in 5 or 6 years from now. This is staggering, frankly speaking. I mean, according to one estimate, Singapore will have more combat planes than the UK in 2020. So, I'm sorry to sound a little bit the alarm, but this has to stop, frankly speaking. Because otherwise, there is very little military capability that will be left across Europe. And that will invite temptation. I mean, I would fully agree with Kori. If we do our homework, I don't think anything bad will happen. But if we continue on that trend in Europe, then, all bets are open.
Anything?
Well, maybe only some few words on the cyber side. We have to see what will happen. But, so far it has been very much resistance, at least within NATO, to go to offensive cyber capacity. It is to defend our own system and national system depending on NATO, that NATO is depending on. And when it comes to offensive cyber, then we have to rely on national capabilities. But maybe we have to see when the development will go now, if the trend will change because of what happened so far.
Great, thanks. Do we have anybody on this side of the room? Yes, in the back. And I'll come up here, and then, yes, Leo, I'll get you.
Nielsen from Danish Embassy. A lot of talk here, obviously, on the reassurance and dissuasion, and also what we have learned, definitely, from this crisis, and that we are maybe getting sort of our act together. But what would be the response, do you think, now, if, let's say, in a year's time, we haven't been able to reverse the situation in Crimea, and Russia takes similar action in Moldova? What would be the response? In Moldova, what would be the response?
Yeah. My guess is that our response in Moldova will be roughly the same as our response in Ukraine has been, which is, that is for a country that is not a NATO member, we are going to take a much more circumspect, much less militarized, much more try and talk the Russians into realizing it's not in their interests. Whereas if it were a NATO member, we have all of us long chosen to interpret Article 5 as having no alternative but to come to each other's defense, and I think that's exactly right. But for countries that are not NATO members, and I think the membership conversation is not going to open up again anytime soon, because all 28 current NATO members are going to have to agree. And given what has happened in Ukraine, they are going to, as our Congress will, be much more reticent about letting anybody in the door. And so I think the real victims, in addition to Ukrainians, of Russia's attack on Ukraine are the other countries in Russia's geographic neighborhood that are going to feel alarmed at being outside the umbrella of NATO's defense.
I fully agree, and I would also add that this is probably one of Putin's goals, to achieve precisely that.
Of course.
Just as a sort of an addition to that, I think we used to talk about the long shadow of nuclear weapons. I think there should be a long shadow of Article 5. Now, if every time something happens in our neighborhood and there is only a mild response, at one point the shadow of Article 5 will be not that long. Whereas the shadow of intimidation from the outside will loom much larger. So yes, you're certainly right, but at one point we might want to take into account even what's outside of the formal guarantee, because otherwise the guarantee itself will get weaker.
We have had the luxury since 1991 to make blurry the lines between NATO members and non-members, right? The Partnership for Peace, to try and create the sense that even countries that we did not take a treaty obligation to defend, that those countries were connected to us. And, one of the effects of Russia's choices is that it's actually hardening the line between NATO members and non-NATO members.
Dane?
Thanks very much. I just wanted to sort of ask you a broader question and target it towards Kori. Others can jump in. Kori, you were fairly critical of the fact that we let ourselves fall into a defense spending debate in reaction to what Russia's doing in Ukraine, the European reassurance initiative maybe not being handled the right way. So step back, and we failed in 2008 to deter Putin from further aggression. We're facing this right now in a more complex way in Ukraine. So what should, step back and from a clear piece of paper, what should be an effective response that's going to deter Putin from taking both further military action, but further hybrid action to fundamentally disrupt, destabilize, occupy his neighbors, if not NATO members?
So my favorite American strategist was a great baseball pitcher, Satchel Paige. And he was once asked what advice he would give young pitchers. And his answer was, throw strikes, right? Because you always strike someone out if you throw strikes. And home plate doesn't move. The big challenge for us on deterring Putin is actually us figuring out as a collective of Western states what we will actually fight to defend and what we will not. And we want to pretend that's not the question. We want to pretend we can finesse it in other ways. But at the end of the day, we know we're going to fight to defend the Article 5 countries. And we are trying to figure out how much we are willing to risk for countries that are partners but not allies. And so the first thing we need to do if we're going to deter Putin is figure out for ourselves what we're going to fight for. And then once we know what we're going to fight for, we actually need to convey that pretty clearly and pretty directly, both through our words and through our actions. Those are hard things for democracies to do, individually and collectively. And it's going to be really hard for us to do as well. The good news is Putin's not that bright. The Russians aren't that strong. We actually are that strong. You know, NATO has at least 16 of the 17 best militaries in the world. And we're funding them badly and we're making cut. All those things are true. But at the end of the day, nobody's going to fight France and win, and unless maybe it's the United States and we have the Canadians on our side. But it's pretty unlikely. I have to work a while to come up with a scenario. We're actually so much stronger than we're giving ourselves credit for. And deterring Putin is a challenge because he's willing to run a risky set of choices to get what he wants. And we are very hesitant about the risks we are willing to run outside the NATO family. So he has a structural advantage over us in this regard. Go.
Real quick follow-up to that. If we are clear that we are not prepared to fight, so if we are clear that we're not prepared to fight for Ukraine, as we frankly have been quite clear, do we still have the tools to be able to actually deter outright destabilization, aggression, recognizing issues of influence?
We still have the tools, but we've increased the price, right? Because if we had defended Ukraine, nobody would doubt that we would defend a small Baltic country like, for example, Lithuania. And by not having defended Ukraine, we are actually more likely to have to prove that we will. I mean, this is the point that you have made several times very well, which is that it's not about what we're saying, it's what about our adversaries are believing. And if we make narrow the universe of things we are willing to defend, then this was McCain's point as well, that you make the margins of our areas of interest much more vulnerable, and you probably make it more expensive when you have to do it.
If I may jump in here, when I made the point that we are doing limited wars today, it meant precisely that out of the huge potential that is ours, only a fraction is usable. Whereas Russia's potential is maybe much lower, but a much higher fraction is usable because the stakes for them are higher. Which is why we're more or less on the par. So we should not compare potentials because the potentials don't exist but on paper. We should compare what is politically usable. And here, I'm not so sure that we are that stronger than the Russians, depending on what's at stake. Second, Damon, I like your questions because it reminds me of French nuclear doctrine in the Cold War. In essence, we told the Soviets, we are going to nuke you. Not if you attack Germany, because West Germany was not covered, it was not extended deterrence, but certainly not once you reach the Rhine River, somewhere in between. Go figure. Okay? And I think that's the heart of the, I mean, again, if there is no shadow of Article 5, then it becomes more difficult to protect Article 5, to make it credible. And the less credible it is, the more taxing will become reassurance and deterrence. And we don't want to get there because we don't want to have to deploy 30,000 troops in Latvia. This is not going to happen in any circumstances that I can think of. So that's why also we need to do our homework now.
I would also just add that, I think we need to be more forceful at stressing the accomplishments that we've made across Europe over the past 25 years and standing up for the policy that we pursued. When George H.W. Bush 25 years ago argued for fostering a Europe whole and free, and we extended that, through the next two administrations to really think about how we could bring peace and prosperity across Europe that had existed previously in Western Europe. It is a major accomplishment of America and its European allies, and we've spent a lot of time since the spring falling into that trap of blaming ourselves for, Etienne, you were talking about people are suggesting that, we pushed the Russians, we humiliated the Russians. There were a lot of difficult issues involved, and I think, the impetus, for the most part, from the policy from the beginning was always to try to pursue this effort and be as inclusive as possible, including trying to establish a cooperative relationship with Russia throughout that was very difficult to pursue. And I think that it's really problematic if we fall into that trap of, we shouldn't have done it because we really upset people like Putin, who, has a very different vision for Europe. And the idea that we would think, yeah, that seems like a better vision than the vision that we've been pursuing for the last 25 years, is pretty perverse, in my humble opinion.
And as long as we're talking about deterrence, for that argument, the argument that we shouldn't have done this to have been successful would have meant we should have been deterred all along from building a Europe that is democratic and stable and prosperous, which is in Europe's interest and ours.
Leo?
Leo, Michel, and you. Etienne, you invited the audience, in effect, someone in the audience to ask you about Mistral. So I wanted to be polite and give you the opportunity to respond.
Thank you so much, Leo.
Would you like to ask them something specific, such as whether they're going to go through with it?
Question mark.
As in, why are you doing this again?
Okay. Well, you know fully well the answer. That decision was made by a previous government in a different era. Probably a rash decision. Decision that it's very difficult to stop now for both industrial, economic, financial reasons. It's not just the Mistral that is at stake. It's not just the jobs in a country that is going through very difficult economic times, with a president who is quite weak today politically. I think everyone understands that. So, but also what's at stake is in the country's reputation on arms markets around the world. So it's very difficult to terminate, to cancel that kind of big sale. Now, finally, I went public on the fact that I think it's a bad idea and should not be done. But I must also say that when I saw a letter from 2 U.S. senators stating that NATO should offer to buy those ships, I thought, well, that's a great idea. How come that nobody supported it? Because, back to what I was saying earlier on the costs, seen from Paris, we are being asked to do Mali, to preserve our forces. Everyone tells us it's very important. You are now the most powerful, capable military in Europe. You need to keep that, not just for you, but for the sake of all Europe, blah, blah, blah. First. Second, you need to pay as a NATO ally, and we do pay a substantial amount, less than the US, but still a substantial amount. Third, to do operations whenever they are needed. And fourth, too bad for you if French weapon systems are not bought, including by allies who, for obvious political calculations, and also for military reasons, depending systematically for some of them by American, because they think they buy a guarantee. So, seen from Paris, it's kind of difficult that we just sit on it. That's as simple as that. So I'm very sorry that this is the situation. It certainly will teach us something about, taking the long view next time. But NATO and or the EU could have been more helpful here. And everything I saw in terms of proposal came from think tankers or a few isolated US senators. So there's absolutely no willingness on the part of our allies to do something. And let me add, on being a little bit more offensive here, After all, that's the best defense, right? It's very convenient that we are the lightning rod in that case, because as you are aware, and many people in this room are aware, a lot of other European countries, including major ones, have interests at stake in Russia that are way bigger than ours. But of course, this is very visible because it's a military sale. So it's very visible. So it's very convenient for everyone that we take a lot of heat about this. But if we were to reach level 3 of sanctions, where supposedly that sale could not happen within the EU framework, then you would see a lot of people actually cry in Europe and not French.
Oh, no, we only have a couple minutes left, so there was one hand there, and I saw one hand over here, because I'm willing to put both questions on the table before, but, okay, there's just one.
Yeah,
There's two right there. Okay, we'll put those two on the table.
Okay, Steve Wallace, recently retired from the Defense Department. I'd like to ask you to comment on the recent leak of comments by the Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski, in which he said basically that the U.S. security guarantee was totally worthless. And basically two aspects of that. Do you believe that view is actually shared by other of our allies in Central and Eastern Europe? And secondly, how do you think his remarks and the kind of very crude language in which they were posed will affect U.S. attitudes toward giving those kind of guarantees to Poland?
And then we'll put the other question on, and then we'll let you guys finish up with your comments.
Hi, Konstantin Avramov, Center for Global Interests. You mentioned about this long shadow and responding to something that happens in our neighborhood. What exactly did you mean by our neighborhood, and where does this neighborhood stop?
Mm-hmm. So first on Radek Sikorski getting caught on tape. Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is that there are days when I agree with him, right? The United States isn't a terrific ally. Our narrative of ourselves is as the indispensable country, but if you actually talk to a Brit long enough, they will eventually tell you that we might have come in World War II 3 years earlier, and it sure would have been good for Europeans. And the United States has a tendency as an ally to believe everyone should immediately drop what they're doing and start caring about what we care about. And the Poles, as new allies, are new to this experience of having us come rushing in with everything we need from them right now, irrespective of what they are concerned about, their domestic politics of it, or how it's going to affect them in the region. So I'm actually kind of sympathetic to the fact that he thinks we're a crummy ally, and not the Obama administration, the United States of America, because we actually kind of are a crummy ally a lot of times. So I wouldn't give it too much sail. Plus, it sounds to me like he was saying it in aggravation, and we're aggravating at times. So I don't think it's that big of a deal. The other thing that's interesting, though, is who taped it and why. I think that's actually a question that Western intelligence services ought to spend a fair amount of time figuring out, because Radek Sikorski is actually quite a strong Atlanticist, as are other people in the Polish government who, get caught in a moment of exasperation saying things, I think, from time to time. So I wouldn't give it too much weight. I would actually wonder why people were doing this. And the third thing is that, welcome to the West. You're going to read it in the newspapers. So on the who's our neighborhood, I actually think the community of values really matters, that those are the countries the United States is willing to kill its sons and daughters to defend, and we should. And so a country that is representatively governed, that cares about, that believes that people have rights and they loan them in limited ways to other governments, to their own government. The way those countries behave, those things all matter. And that's what I mean by our neighborhood.
There is no good answer. Again, first,
I gave a good answer. What the hell are you talking about?
from my point of view, it's a balance of power thing. So the Russians will advance, or others will advance as far as they can. And whether or not we find a midway will depend. And we don't want to say this is covered, this is not covered, for reasons I just explained about the nuclear deterrence. They have to wonder whether or not they can go so far. So we'll never specify, this country is covered, this country not covered. But as Kori pointed out, countries that are not in NATO, in principle, are not covered. Now, for the Russians and others, they should just beware or be aware of the fact that at one point, even though it's not covered by NATO, they might step a little bit too far, and then they'll in for big trouble.
Last word, yeah? You're good. Well, I just want to thank our three panelists. Really appreciate all the insight and wisdom. Thanks to you all for attending, and those that ask questions. Appreciate you putting those on the table. And enjoy the short break before the next group comes on up. Thank you guys very much.